Chapter 25. Simplicity. Unsurprisingly, the primary crop that Applejuice and his family grew was apples. A sizable orchard was sprawled out across the hills behind his home, the trees neatly planted to form even rows. While nowhere near as big as some plots of land for crops, especially around larger cities that needed that sort of food production, the orchard wasn't exactly small. Scarlet took in a deep breath through her nose, savoring the fresh air and faint aroma of the apples in the trees. A warm breeze passed between the trunks, making the leaves rustle softly. A few birds sprang from their branch, sang at each other, and then touched down on another one not far away. Late morning sunlight streamed down between the branches, creating a series of mesmerizing stripes across the ground. A loud thunk from her right drew her attention. Scarlet turned and saw Applejuice by one of the trees a few rows over, having just bucked the trunk. The force of the kick had shaken the tree to its roots and sent every apple on its branches falling neatly into the buckets that were arranged at the base. A few went bouncing and rolling away, although Applejuice did not seem to notice. One of those apples came to a stop by Scarlet's hoof. She eyed it for a second before smiling and lifting it in her magic. "Juice!" she called out to the stallion. She waited until he turned to face her before lightly chucking it at him. "Whoa!" he yelped, just catching the apple in his hooves. He looked down at it, then gave Scarlet a small smirk. "You trying to ambush me or something?" he asked. Scarlet shook her head and drew closer. "No, but that one got away," she replied before lighting up her horn again and pulling off the saddlebag she had on her back. "Your wife sent me. She asked me to bring you your lunch." "She did?" Applejuice blinked, confused. He then looked up at the sky and realization dawned on his face, alongside the surface of his hoof. "Oh, hell. Lost track of time, didn't I?" "You could say that," Scarlet replied before setting the bags down. "If you'll permit me to be so bold, I imagine this is a somewhat common occurrence. Wind was rather casual about you losing yourself in the orchard." Applejuice chuckled before reaching into the saddlebags. Inside was an assorted lunch comprised of a daffodil sandwich, a condensed apple pie, and a small block of hay. He smiled at the meal and withdrew the sandwich first. "I'm ashamed to admit it, but yeah, sometimes I get a little into it," he admitted before taking a bite. Scarlet raised an eyebrow. "And that's never caused you any trouble?" "It has sometimes," Applejuice answered after swallowing. "I just want to make sure my family's alright, that's all. Making sure I got a big enough crop for the winter is a big part of that." Scarlet hummed in understanding, turning and staring out into the rows and rows of trees. Even if the orchard was comparatively small, when compared to her, it seemed to be an onerous task to harvest that many apples, especially by kicking the trunks. "I think I understand, but this is a lot of ground for one pony to cover." "Sure is," Applejuice acknowledged with a slow nod of his head. "But my boy's too little to be bucking apples, and Wynn's better at things with a gentle touch. Household stuff. Call us old-fashioned if you wanna." "As long as you're all happy with your roles," Scarlet eventually said before turning back to face Applejuice directly, her expression turning serious. "But you never get any help with the harvest?" Applejuice shook his head. "No, not really. Sometimes Wynn'll tag along if I've got a cold or something, but that's usually just to make sure I don't hurt myself," he said before taking another big bite from his sandwich. "Most of the time, just me." Scarlet was quiet for a few seconds, wrestling with an idea in her head. Eventually, the idea won out over her reservations, and she met Applejuice's gaze. "Well, would you like some help?" Applejuice was clearly not expecting that question, as he suddenly let out a series of coughs. He put a hoof up to his lips once they died down to make sure his food stayed in his mouth where it belonged, then swallowed. He fixed Scarlet with an incredulous stare. What? Scarlet took a step forward.
I'm offering to help you out. I'm no farmer, but I imagine I can make myself useful.
Juice stared at her, slack-jawed for a short time. He composed himself quickly and set the sandwich back into the saddlebags. I appreciate the offer, miss, but I can't be asking you to do that. You're still pretty tender from your wounds, after all, and you're my guest. Scarlet held her ground, her ears drooping.
Look, as long as I'm here, I want to make myself useful. We're taking up space in your home and food on your tables as long as we're under your roof. I want to make sure I do something to make up for that inconvenience, and helping out around the farm however I can seems to me like the best way to do it.
To Scarlet's surprise, Applejuice uttered a short, barking laugh at that. He walked up to her and gave her a good-natured clap on the shoulder. You see, that kind of attitude is what would normally make me say yes to the offer, he told her with a big smile. But this ain't exactly a normal situation we're in, you know? Y'all brought Primrose back to us after looking after her and keeping her safe when we couldn't. You saved her life, Scarlet. Letting you and your friends sleep under our roof and eat our food is how we are repaying you. Scarlet didn't have an immediate rebuttal for that. She fell silent, her ears lowering. As true as the farmer's sentiment may have been, he was still missing the fact that Scarlet had been the one to drop her guard long enough for Primrose to be hurt in the first place. She'd failed to do her job as Prim's protector, and the foal had almost died as a result.
I still want to help,
Scarlet eventually insisted, her expression hardening.
If not to make it up to you for the inconvenience, then to make it up to myself for failing to protect her when it mattered.
Applejuice hummed at that, withdrawing his hoof. You really think it was your fault? He asked quietly, his voice low. Scarlet looked away, her ears drooping.
Maybe you won't see it that way, but I did fail her. She was injured on my watch. It was my job to make sure she was safe and protected, and she almost died because I wasn't paying enough attention. There's nothing more to it than that. Nothing that matters, at least.
Bullshit. Applejuice shot down without missing a beat. Scarlet turned to face him again, her ears perking up in surprise. His expression had hardened, becoming stern. She got hurt, yeah, and obviously none of us wanted that to happen. And hell, maybe you could have prevented it. Don't matter one bit now, though. What matters is that you brought her to us to save her. As far as I care, you more than made up for that mistake already. Scarlet went to offer up a counterpoint, but he silenced her by holding up a hoof. He slowly shook his head and his expression softened considerably. Trust me, ma'am, I get it, I do. I got a little boy of my own, remember? I have to carry the responsibility of raising him right all the time. It's real easy to tell myself that I messed up, that I did something wrong whenever I see Star doing something dumb or stupid. And yeah, I am his parent, so part of it probably is my fault. He looked directly into Scarlet's eyes. But Wynn's always the one reminding me that sometimes there's stuff I just can't control. All I can do is be there for my boy when he needs me, and try to steer him right when he goes wrong, and make up for any mistakes that I made on the way. But you, Scarlet Frost, got nothing else to make up for. You saved her life. You reunited us with her. I can't think of anything more redeeming than that. A hushed silence fell over the two of them after that. Scarlet took a few steps back, her eyes wandering with indecision. She was jarred from her trance, though, when a bucket was set down by her hooves. Confused, she looked up and saw Applejuice smiling back at her. Now, all that said, I know a stubborn filly when I see one. If you want to help so bad, then I guess I can humor you, he said, flashing her a wink. Scarlet's muscles slowly began to relax, and she nodded gratefully.
Thank you. What do you need me to do?
Not much. You're still recovering from some nasty wounds, so I just want you to place the buckets down and float them into the wagon when they're full. Got to step out of my routine without straining yourself too bad. Sound fair? Scarlet's answer was to ignite her horn with magic and move the filled buckets of apples over to the wagon itself, settling them down in mere seconds. Applejuice's smile grew. Oh, glad we're at an understanding. After Applejuice finished off his lunch, the two set to work in the orchards. Scarlet did as instructed, her work mostly consisting of moving barrels around while Applejuice bucked the trees and determined their course. Scarlet's magic sped things along quite considerably, and more than once the farmer openly joked, saying something along the lines of, "This must be cheating or something." It was a very monotonous and repetitive job. Of that there could be no doubt. But despite how boring it may have seemed to an outsider, Scarlet got lost in the motions all the same. She wasn't sure what it was about the work that had her so enthralled, that made her listen with rapt attention whenever Juice launched into a free-form lecture about what and what not to do when farming. She wasn't sure why this boring, tedious task was so relaxing for her. It was only after they had been at it for about 2 hours or so that it finally clicked in her head. A memory from the early days after the war, when she was still early on in her pregnancy, came to her mind, making her briefly stop mid-task. Her sudden halt did not go unnoticed. Applejuice came by and lightly touched his hoof to her shoulder, drawing her out of her trance. Hey, something wrong? Scarlet shook her head, smiling.
No, nothing's wrong. I was just remembering something, that's all,
she said, putting the empty buckets down by the base of the next tree. Applejuice nodded and got into position. That so? Mind if I ask what about? Scarlet hummed, looking up into the sky.
You know that I fought in the war against Talonreach, right?
She asked after a moment, bitterness creeping into her voice. Applejuice hummed in acknowledgement before kicking the tree, sending the apples falling. I know. Why?
When I first got home after I was discharged, it was difficult for me to adapt to being a civilian again,
Scarlet admitted, her shoulders slumping.
I had seen and done a lot of terrible things. A lot of killing. Being surrounded by something normal again was just... It was hard to take in at first. My sleep was often plagued by night terrors, and I found myself jumping at shadows, expecting a griffin ambush at a moment's notice.
Applejuice said nothing. He simply stood still and listened as Scarlet went on.
Eventually, though, I found work at a local academy. I became a librarian. Sorting books, returning them to the shelves, renting them out to students, slapping hooves over late returns, and the like. It was just...
She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, a tiny smile growing on her face.
It was just so simple. I honestly kept thinking that I must have been missing something for a long time because there was no way I could be doing a job and have it be so relaxing. But in the end, I think that's part of why I wound up loving that job so much. It was just simple. There weren't any high stakes involved, and I never once had to bust out my combat training when I worked there. I was just sorting and reading books.
She opened her eyes and let out a quiet chuckle.
After spending more years than I'm proud admitting fighting on the front lines of a bloody war, going to such a soothing line of work felt almost like heaven. Like it was my reward for finally getting out of there, while I still had a life to live.
Applejuice's face lit up with a warm smile. He adjusted his hat on his head slightly. Well, shucks, that's good to hear, Scarlet. I know that a lot of ponies who came home from that war never really got back to a normal life. It was almost like they forgot how to live. Scarlet hummed quietly, idly moving the now filled buckets to the wagon with her magic.
Well, I got lucky. And helping you out here on the farm is almost like a second wind of that same feeling,
she explained, her eyes shimmering slightly.
I've been on the road, fighting for my life and always looking over my shoulder, ever since I met Primrose. To just help with something like this?
Applejuice came up to her side and gave her a light pat on the shoulder. Well, glad to know you're enjoying yourself. Scarlet chuckled and brushed him off. She shook her head before giving him a meaningful smile.
Thank you for this. I think I needed to remember what the simple things were like before I forgot them again.
Applejuice nodded and made his way for the wagon. You're welcome. When all this business with Silent and the lamp is done, maybe you and that Lens fella could settle down somewhere quiet and you can have a simple life with him. Scarlet paused at that, her ears standing at attention.
A simple life with Lens?
She echoed. She then let out a quiet laugh, letting her head hang.
You know, back when Lens and I got discharged, I wanted nothing more than to settle down somewhere with him.
Something change? Scarlet sighed, her ears drooping.
You could say that.
I won't pry, Applejuice eventually said, hitching himself back up to the wagon. Anywho, I think we're just about ready to bring this load back to the barn. Won't you go on ahead and... Scarlet! There you are! Scarlet jumped in her skin when Lens's voice suddenly cut through the trees. Alarmed, she spun around and saw him sprinting madly for her. A lump formed in her throat, a worm of anxiety wriggling its way into her heart. Had Silent found them?
Lens! What is it? What's wrong?
She called out. Lens came to a sliding stop a few feet away, panting slightly. He pointed back towards the house.
It's Primrose. She's awake.
Scarlet's eyes widened.
What? When?
Just a few minutes ago,
Lens answered.
She's talking to Wind and Star right...
Scarlet didn't wait to hear the rest of it. She shot past Lens at a full sprint, disregarding the slight burning sensation in her forelegs from where she had been slashed before. She quickly left the two stallions behind, the trees of the orchard passing by in a wild blur. It wasn't long before she barreled through the tree line and came up to the wall of the house. Her horn flared with magic as she came upon it, before her entire body was enveloped in a burst of light. She came out of the teleport into the central room, sliding for a few inches before coming to a stop. She spun on her hooves and threw open the door to the guest room.
Primrose!
She called out. Windrain and Star looked over at her from their place by the filly's bed, startled by her sudden appearance. Scarlet's eyes drifted past both of them, however, settling on the tired-looking earth pony filly who was sitting up in the bed, staring back at her with relief.
Scarlet,
she greeted with a worn-out smile, her voice quiet and weak. Scarlet stood perfectly still, as relief and joy flooded her veins. Her lip began to tremble, and a barely audible sound came from the bottom of her voice. She staggered forwards, never once taking her eyes off of Primrose. She collapsed by the bedside before reaching out and drawing the filly into a hug. She pulled her as close against her chest as he could and protected her with her hooves. She felt Primrose returning the embrace, and that motion alone drew a small whimper out of Scarlet. She closed her eyes as tears blazed hot trails down her cheeks and buried her face in Primrose's messy mane.
Primrose. Oh my goodness. You're all right.
Scarlet choked out, on the verge of sobbing as several days of tension and stress and anxiety finally got a chance to be let out. Primrose hummed quietly into Scarlet's chest fur, cuddling closer to her and basking in her body heat.
I'm okay.
She mumbled before shivering uncontrollably.
That silent got me.
I know, sweetie, I know.
Scarlet whispered, squeezing Prim up to her heart.
I'm so sorry. I won't let that happen ever again, I promise.
Primrose didn't say anything else. She just stayed there, letting Scarlet hold her close while the unicorn mare wept tears of joy.